Okay, here is the second part of our lesson about the evidence that exists that not only evolution has occurred, but that it is likely occurred, as Darwin described, from natural selection, and that we are all fundamentally related, and branches come off of branches until we get all of the twigs at the end of the tree, all the different species. So, the next pile of evidence that supports this idea of evolution is what we call comparative anatomy. So anatomy are different parts of the body, and comparative just means we are comparing different body parts of different organisms. So comparing the anatomical structures of different organisms, both living and fossils, to determine how related they are. Now, what this allows us to do is find body part structures called homologous structures, okay? So homologous structures are structures that are found in different species that may, in fact, look quite different superficially if you just look at them very quickly. But if you look a little deeper, they have similarities that indicate that they have a common origin. These body parts have a common origin or came from a common ancestor shared between these different species. Okay, so an example of homologous structures. So let's talk real quick. Let's talk about your arm. Who knows your bones in your arm? So this bone right here is your humerus, right? You have two bones in your forearm. These are your radius. Your thumb can radiate in a circle, so that's your radius. This is your ulna. It goes to make your funny bone. These in your wrist, anybody know? They are your carpals, the little tiny wrist bones. The bones of your palm are your metacarpals, and of course your finger bones are known as your phalanges, okay? And your bones in your arm and hand are designed to do very specific things, okay? Now, let me show you another animal besides you, okay, who also has some bones. Okay. So, hang on. This is a bat, okay? But what I want you to notice about this bat is his wing, okay? His wing is just like your arm in terms of the bones that are present. So let me show you. Now watch these two fingers. This is his little humerus. He has two bones here side by side, just like you do in your forearm, radius and ulna. Right here is his tiny little wrist, and from that wrist he has a palm with 5 fingers extending from it, okay? So watch. Here is his tiny little thumb right there. That's his thumb. These two, you can't probably even see these. They're so close together, but right where these fingers are holding, he has 2 bones. Those are his his index and his middle finger. This is his ring finger right here, and this one is his pinky. So he has an arm, a hand with 5 fingers, just like you do, a thumb, but instead of being modified to write and all of that, and grab things, his hand is modified to act when he spreads out his fingers as a wing, okay? The bones are all there. The bones are all there. So, hang on just a minute. Okay, so And bats aren't the only ones that have this bone arrangement. There are all kinds of mammals that have a forelimb that is designed in essentially the same way. If you look right here, let me see if I can get my little marker. Yeah, there it is. All right, so here's your arm, humerus, radius and ulna, carpals right there at the wrist, and then these darker brown are the metacarpals and phalanges. Now, your kitty cat, same thing, humerus, radius ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. It's one big bone, one bone, two bones, lots of little bones. One bone, two bone, lots of little bones. That's how this pattern reveals itself over and over again. Look here, a whale, a whale. Why would a whale have fingers? It's got a fin. These humerus, radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Why are there fingers here? They were completely encased in a fin structure. And the reason is because that's what its common ancestor had, that we share with all mammals of this common ancestor. And of course, here's the bat we just talked about. One bone, two bones, lots of little bones, wrist, metacarpals, and phalanges. The bone pattern repeats itself over and over and over again in mammals and in organisms that gave rise to mammals. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I want you to think of this picture here of these different forelimbs from a bat, a cat, a whale, a human, as an example of something called adaptive radiation, okay? We talked about this when we talked about Darwin's finches, for example. It is the study of homologous structures that allows us to see common origins, common ancestry for many seemingly different species. So common origin, like we have one ancestor species, maybe the South American finch that got blown over from the mainland, and it gave rise to a bunch of different finches. It radiated out. So with adaptive radiation, one common ancestor gives rise to many descendant species. So maybe this is our ancestor and we get all these different species from it. It radiates out, okay? Certainly, adaptive radiation explains the homologous structures we are seeing in these mammalian forelimbs. There was some common ancestor that had this bone pattern, and it gave rise to all of these different organisms over a very long period of time. Now, there were lots of steps in between, okay? But keep in mind, even reptiles and amphibians have many of these same bones, suggesting that we share an ancestry going way back into the deep trunk of that vertebrate family tree, going all the way back to amphibians. So that leads us to the question, is there, in fact, a common ancestor to all amphibians, all reptiles, all mammals? Are we all related back to a common ancestor? And the answer is yes, and we've actually found it. Another transitional fossil, remember I said we have loads of transitional fossils in the fossil record, fossils that share characteristics between two different groups, showing a transition between them. This amazing fossil, this is a model of the fossil right here. This is a model of the actual fossil they found. Obviously, this is an artist's depiction of the actual animal sculpture. Tiktaalik rosier. Tiktaalik is an example of a transition organism that shows the transition from fish living in water to amphibians just emerging onto the land. So what you expect, an organism like that was predicted to exist by what we thought about how vertebrates evolved. We thought fish were the first vertebrates and all the land vertebrates came later. But if that's true, we would expect to find some transitional organism between fish and amphibians. And this fossil is almost as though someone took an artist's picture and said, here you go. I mean, it is exactly what was predicted the transitional organism ought to look like. And what is most interesting about this animal is that what really connects it as a fish that might have been the very ancestor of all the animals that came to live on land is the structure of its fins. If you look at the very end of the fin, it has a fish fin. It's got, you know, if you've ever seen a fish fin, and here's fishy, okay? Boy, this is bad. All right, so here he's got fins, you know, and they've got those kind of feathery, pointy structures, and they got these, he's got that, okay, right here on his little limb. But if you look up in here, this part of the limb is very thick and meaty, and if you look into it further, what you see are the same exact bones that we see in every mammal we know of, and in reptiles and amphibians. We see this big bone, two bones, radius, ulna here, and lots of little bones, that wrist and metacarpals and phalanges. We see the pattern repeat itself over and over and over again, starting here. This is the first place we see it, is in this vertebrate. When they found this limb bone, they were like, wow. This primitive forelimb had the support needed to be able to kind of crawl and scoot around in shallow water areas, maybe even haul the organism up onto land, maybe to escape a predator or snatch at a bug or something like that. But those are the beginning. That is the beginning right there of your arm. You are connected all the way back to this ancestor many millions of years ago. So what I'm going to do is play this video and let you hear Neil Shubin, who is the guy that discovered this fossil, talk about what that was like.
My name's Neil Shubin. I'm from the University of Chicago, where I'm a professor in the faculty of the anatomy department there. I also hold an appointment at the Field Museum of Natural History, also in Chicago. So you have to understand the setting. The setting of the day we found it was, this was our last expedition to the Canadian Arctic. We were running out of money, and I'm not saying this for drama. It's really expensive to work there. We'd worked there for a number of years already with very little success. We had not much to show for ourselves. We decided to sort of spend the lot and have one last season working at that layer. So Steve's cracking rocks, and Steve is up, about 7 feet from me. He says, hey Neil, what's this? And I remember looking at the thing and saying, okay, we have a flat-headed fish. I looked at Ted and Farish, who were the co-leaders of the expedition. We were like, oh my God. I mean, there was two feelings. One was just incredible joy, but the other was incredible relief, which is really, this is our last chance at this. And as soon as I saw what this object was, I knew we had found what we had spent 6 years, and I had spent about 20 years before looking for it. Since I was a graduate student, I was interested in one of the great evolutionary events in Earth history, which is the transition from life in water to life on land. And you think about that, it's a remarkable transition, because so much in the animals have to change. So I got interested early on in this transition, and my goal was to find new evidence that tells us about how it happened. So what I did, starting in the early 90s, was to try to find rocks in the world that had the right properties to hold the fossils that would tell us about this transition. From a fish that has like a conical head and fins, to a land-living animal of the time, in the Devonian, which has a flat head with limbs. So we looked around the world, and it eventually became clear through a moment of serendipity that one of the best places and most unexplored places to look for such a fossil was in the Canadian Arctic. We discovered it from a geological textbook, not the scientific literature. It was completely accidental. But it turns out these were the perfect rocks of the right age and exposed at the surface to produce such an intermediate. And what it looks like is you have a flat head with eyes on top, and then you essentially have the body of what looks like a fish, a stubby fish, because it has scales and these stubby fins. Now what's great about Tiktaalik, it's a real melange of characteristics of fish and land-living creature. And the shape of the head, the proportions of the head, and the bones and so forth are very much like a land-living animal, and then other parts are fish-like. What's remarkable about the fin is when you take out the fin webbing, it has bones that correspond to upper arm, i.e. humerus, forearm, i.e. radius and ulna, and even portions of the wrist, the so-called proximal carpal. So a real remarkable transitional creature. It had both lungs and gills. And what's exceptional about this is just how ordinary it is, in the sense that it's exactly the intermediate that you would likely predict. So what this does is it tells us a lot about the shift from water to land, along with the other creatures. And so there are hundreds of other fossils that colleagues around the world have found. It tells us a lot about how this great transition happened. When Tiktaalik was announced in the pages of Nature, we had 2 articles, which was nice because it gave us a chance to do a lot of description, basic description of the creature. Well, it hit a lot of news headlines in April of 2006 when it came out. So much so, I was dropping my son off at school the day it was announced, and his teacher said, "Hey, bring in the fish." So I brought the cast of the fossil, which we had made at that point. I remember showing it to the kids, and I said, "Hey guys, what do you think it is?" One kid said, "Oh, it looks like a crocodile." And you could see why he said it's like a crocodile, because there's flathead eyes on top, and you can even see teeth on the side. Another kid corrected him and said, no, it's a fish. It's got scales, and it has fins. And I said, "Hey, you're both right," because they got the concept right immediately, And so, if only adults in Louisiana would get what kids got really quickly in a preschool. What inspires me is this transition from life in water to life on land. It is not just some esoteric twig on the evolutionary tree. It's very important for us. It's very important because this event is part of our own evolutionary history when our common ancestor was a fish. So that this proto-wrist we see for the first time in Tiktaalik and its evolutionary cousins, something that became our own wrist. This neck that we see for the first time in Tiktaalik and its evolutionary cousins is something that was to become our own necks. Inside our organs, inside our genes, inside our cells, carry artifacts of the history of life, carry events like this, of which this is just one of countless events in the last 3 billion years.
Okay. So let's see, let me get back to where we were. Okay, so that's the story of Tiktaalik and as a transitional organism. Now, please be careful, because sometimes evolution makes really confusing organisms that look a lot like they're related to each other. They look like they have homologous structures that are due to common ancestry, but they are not. So what I have on the screen here is, I hope you recognize, a dolphin. And this, I also hope you recognize, is a shark. Now you look at those animals. They are gray, they are streamlined, they both live in the water, they're both predators, they eat fish, they have fins. They look pretty darn closely related, they act closely related, but are they closely related? And of course, they are not, because this animal is a mammal. It feeds its offspring with milk. It is a mammal. This animal is a fish. It is not, they are related, but very distantly, way back. So how is it that they look so much alike? We've got to be careful and not decide that they must be closely related just based on the way that they look. So what they are an example of, and another example here, is something called convergent evolution. So if you converge with another person, you meet them. You meet them where they are. So you're over here, the other person's over here, and you converge. This is the same thing that's happening here. Two organisms converge in the way they look. They look similar, but they originate in two different places. Okay? It's sort of the opposite of adaptive radiation, if you will. In adaptive radiation, you have one common ancestor gives rise to many different looking things. In this case, you have two different looking things that are not very closely related, yet they end up looking like each other because of convergent evolution. So what could cause two species that are not particularly closely related look like they could be? So if you look at this bird and this butterfly, you might say, well, they both have wings. They must be related. They kind of have similar ways of moving around. They both fly. But of course, you know that an insect and a bird are not terribly closely related at all. So why would organisms that are only very distantly related have such similar characteristics? And the reason is because they occupy similar niches, similar roles in similar environments. If we go back, let's go back to these guys the water sculpts organisms in very particular ways. And one very common way organisms do well in water is to be streamlined, to blend into the water with your coloration and all of that. And both of these organisms living in water has kind of sculpted them to have really similar characteristics, because that's what does well in water. If you're going to fly, you better have broad, flat surfaces to catch a lot of air, and so that's why these organisms they're doing similar things in their environment. So in aquatic environments, natural selection is almost always going to favor fins over legs, unless you're crawling along the bottom. But for fish, you know, that fins over legs is going to be driving organisms that might not have started out with fins to get fins quickly if they're going to be living in water. So another example, seals and penguins. They are both vertebrates, backboned animals, so they do share that in common, but one is a mammal, the seal is a mammal, and the penguin is a bird. So they are pretty far apart in terms of how related they are, but they have a whole lot of characteristics in common. They both have streamlined bodies. They both have insulated bodies. They both have flippers for limbs. So why do they share all these characteristics in common if they are not closely related? Because they are living in a cold Arctic environment where the main food source available is fish, and you've got to be able to survive in that cold. You've got to be able to swim to get food. And those characteristics are ideal for that. So even if they both started in different places, one started as a bird, one started as a mammal, natural selection in those environments has kind of forced them to have similar characteristics. These similar characteristics, for example, fin limbs in mammals and fish, or penguins and seals, they are called analogous structures, not homologous, because they do not necessarily indicate a close evolutionary relationship. They don't necessarily indicate common origin. So what they do indicate is that these organisms are trying to do similar things in a similar environment. This bird and this butterfly are both trying to fly, and therefore they're going to have adaptations that kind of look similar to achieve that purpose. Dolphins and sharks are both trying to swim. They're going to have similar adaptations that serve that purpose, even though they aren't particularly closely related to each other. Okay, so this is what convergent evolution results in. Organisms that are not particularly closely related, but they end up with similar structures because the way the environment is sculpting them through natural selection. Okay, so that's that. We will pick up here for the last part 3, our last part of this Evidence for Evolution notes. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys are well. Take care.